Chapter 22 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 5. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 5 by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Stonewall Jackson's Valley Campaign. As we have said before, it was the intention of the administration to dispatch the whole of McDowell's corps to reinforce McClellan as soon as the situation in northern Virginia would permit. Franklin's division was so dispatched in ample time to have taken part in the operations against Yorktown, though General McClellan made no use whatever of that fine body of troops until Yorktown was evacuated. Preparations were vigorously made by the government for the march of McDowell towards Richmond, and Shields's division, one of the best of Banks's army, was ordered to reinforce him. The most important results were expected from such an attack as an officer of McDowell's ability and zeal would have made upon the left flank of the Confederate forces in front of Richmond. It is one of the admitted misfortunes of the war that this attack was never made, and the question as to who was responsible for it has given rise to much discussion. A simple statement of the facts in the case, without imputation of ignoble motives in any quarter, seems the preferable way to treat this subject. It may be profitable for a moment to consider the character of that remarkable man whose campaign in the Shenandoah Valley produced this derangement of the plans of the government. General Thomas Jonathan, commonly called Stonewall Jackson, was by far the most interesting and picturesque figure in the Southern army. His brilliant successes and his early death enshrined him in the hearts of his associates as their foremost champion, while the intense religious enthusiasm which appeared in all his public and private utterances added the halo of the saint to the laurels of the hero. In what we shall have to say in regard to this singular character, we shall refer to no facts except those recorded by Confederate writers, and although we may not be able to accept all their conclusions, it cannot be contested that General Jackson was a man of extraordinary qualities, and a soldier whose successes were due no less to his abilities than to his good fortune and the mistakes of his adversaries. Though connected with a family of fair standing in Virginia, his father died poor after wasting his substance in drink and play. The boy grew up in the care of relatives, twice running away from the roof which sheltered him, and returning soiled, ragged, and emaciated by the ague. His early education was defective. He earned his living by hard labor, and for a time served as a rural constable until he accidentally received an appointment to the military academy at West Point. He is remembered by his contemporaries there as a slow, dull, unprepossessing youth, of great correctness of conduct and untiring industry in his studies. He served creditably in the Mexican War, and soon after it ended resigned his place in the army and became a teacher in the Virginia Military School at Lexington, where he lived for 10 years. He was not especially popular or successful as a teacher. His manner was lacking in tact, his character in flexibility. Had the war not come to call him forth to glory and the grave, he would probably have lived and died in that mountain village, known only to his neighbors, to use Dr. Dabney's expression, as a sincere, odd, weak man. We find in the writings of several of his eulogists indications of singularities which border upon monomania. Colonel Freemantle says, on the authority of the Confederate General Slaughter, when he left the United States service, he was under the impression that one of his legs was getting shorter than the other, and afterwards his idea was that he only perspired on one side, and that it was necessary to keep the arm and leg of the other side in constant motion in order to preserve the circulation. But the war was his opportunity. There was not a quality of heart, mind, or temperament which he possessed that did not contribute to his success and his fame. Even his weaknesses ministered to his strength. He had been a sufferer from ophthalmia, and could not use his eyes at night. He had therefore acquired the habit of reviewing mentally all the reading of the day, while sitting silent in the midst of his family with his face to the wall, and had thus gained a remarkable power of concentration of thought and memory of details. His digestion in his youth was feeble and capricious. He had for that reason accustomed himself to the utmost abstemiousness, and it was no sacrifice to him to share the meagre fare of his soldiers on the march. But the quality which gained for him much of his influence in the army, and which contributed most largely to that sentiment of devotion with which his memory is regarded in the South and in England, was his intense religious enthusiasm. Anything like it is rarely met with in modern times. We must go back to the ages of unquestioning faith, to Philip II, to Torquemada, to find a parallel to it. He believed himself to be under the immediate and partisan protection of his Creator. He believed, and his biographer thinks the belief perfectly reasonable, that Heaven helped him plan his campaigns and battles. His Creator was ever present to his mind in his own image, as good a Southerner, as earnest a hater of the Yankees, as stern a fighter as himself. He conversed with him constantly. He interpreted literally the injunction to pray without ceasing. "When we take our meals," he would say, "there is the grace. When I take a draught of water, I always pause, as my palate receives the refreshment, to lift up my heart to God in thanks and prayer for the water of life. Whenever I drop a letter into the box of the post office, I send a petition along with it for God's blessing upon its mission and upon the person to whom it is sent. When I break the seal of a letter just received, I stop to pray to God that He may prepare me for its contents and make it a messenger of good." And so of every other familiar act of the day. A great part of his time in the saddle was passed in the act of prayer. 100 times a day he would be seen to throw his right hand aloft, and to move his lips in silent supplication. His constant entreaty to his friends was that they should continually pray that he might be the instrument to wreak heaven's purposes upon his adversaries. He believed himself selected especially for the work he was doing. He was a hammer in the hands of God for the destruction of the ungodly. The firmest convictions of religious duty were easily reconciled with the exigencies of the military service, which seemed to violate them. He was a fanatical Sabbatarian. He would not read a letter which arrived Saturday night until Monday. He would not post one in such a way that it would travel on the Sabbath. Yet he would not scruple to bring on a bloody battle on Sunday, if he could catch his enemy at a disadvantage. In that case, of course, it was the Lord's will. When he was sent to destroy some railroad property, he thought with regret how many Bibles could have been printed with the proceeds, but none the less he destroyed it. The self-consciousness inseparable from such a temperament took with him its usual contrasted forms of shyness and vanity. His biographer quotes him as relating that when in Mexico he made the acquaintance of some agreeable Spanish families, but finding the ladies too fascinating, he firmly withdrew himself before his self-respect was tarnished. There were no bounds to his bashful self-conceit. He did not scruple to say, on every occasion where the feasibility of certain accomplishments was referred to, "I can accomplish anything I will to perform." In matters of trivial concern, such as diet and drink, he held himself up as a model. "Do as I do," he would say, "my head never aches." When he first began to lead in public prayer, his excessive self-consciousness made the effort painful to himself and others, but none the less he persevered. It was especially characteristic of him that he ascribed to the Deity the credit of all that was done for him. At every promotion he received, he burst forth into ardent ejaculations of praise to heaven. None of God's creatures ever received his thanks. When he got his first important command, he said, "I am very thankful to my kind Heavenly Father for having given me such a fine brigade." After Bull Run, nettled at not having got what he deemed his fair share of newspaper notice, he wrote to his wife, "God made my brigade more instrumental than any other in repulsing the main attack." And again, "My brigade is not a brigade of newspaper correspondents. I know that the first brigade was the first to meet and pass our retreating forces, to push on with no other aid than the smiles of God, to arrest the victorious foe," etc., etc. Later, when the honors he had so fairly won began to come to him, he wrote, "I am very thankful to that good God who withholds no good thing from me, though I am so utterly unworthy and so ungrateful, for making me a Major General of the Provisional Army of the Confederate States." His joy at his promotion, however, did not prevent him from saying to his pastor, who was visiting his camp, that promotion among men was a temptation and a trouble, and that he would not accept it except in the light of a duty. He seemed incapable of gratitude to anything mortal, reminding one of Philip II, who built a monastery to God, and St. Lawrence to commemorate a victory and sent the generals who had won it to the scaffold. His efforts at evangelizing the negroes, of which so much is made by his eulogists, had a peculiar character. He established and carried on a Sunday school for them with unflinching zeal, but he was too sincere an adherent of slavery to give anything but oral instruction. The alphabet was too dangerous an engine to trust in their hands. They received their hymns, catechisms, and texts directly from the lips of their teachers, as was the general custom in the South. Yet on one occasion he went among the free blacks and encouraged them to contribute out of their poverty for the funds of the Bible Society. Professor Dabney says, he required all his slaves to attend the domestic worship of his family morning and evening, and succeeded where so many Christian masters have found entire success apparently impossible, in securing the presence of every one. But in the same paragraph the eulogist naively gives the key of his success. Absolute obedience was the rule of his household, and if he found chastisement was necessary to secure this, it was faithfully administered. In all these singular traits of character we discern a striking resemblance to another of the remarkable personages of this great conflict. If John Brown of Osawatomie had been bred in a slave state and had received a West Point training, it is hard to see in what particular he would have differed from Stonewall Jackson. It was natural that such a character as this should play a great part in a civil war. With his early training to the military art, his knowledge of details rendered unusually accurate by 10 years of teaching, his memory extraordinarily strengthened by the exercise to which it had been subjected, a temperament of the greatest eagerness and ardor in the pursuit of his purposes, a will of iron and energy which knew no fatigue and required no stimulus, a devotion to the supposed interests of his section heightened by his frank hatred and contempt of his enemy, a feeling of invincibility and a disregard of danger natural to one who had no doubt of the continual presence of the Lord of hosts by his side, helping him plant his batteries and array his columns for attack, and above all an intense love of fighting for its own sake and for the sake of fame, for which he longed with a devouring thirst. All these qualities combined to make him the first of the subordinate Southern leaders, a soldier incomparable for any employment where energy, celerity, and audacity were desired. He won great credit at the Battle of Bull Run, but his first independent campaign resulted in signal defeat. In March 1862, he was ordered by General Johnston to occupy the attention of Banks in the Shenandoah Valley. He advanced rapidly in pursuance of what he understood to be the spirit of his orders, and came in view of Shields's division at Kernstown near Winchester on the 22nd of March. A brief skirmish took place that evening, in the course of which General Shields was severely wounded, his arm being broken by the fragment of a shell. He retired to Winchester, and General Nathan Kimball remained on the field in active command of the division. The next day, although it was Sunday, Jackson, thinking he had his enemy at a disadvantage, and unaware either of his numbers or his disposition, attacked Kimball with great impetuosity, but met with a severe repulse. Kimball, who was ably seconded by Colonels Jeremiah C. Carroll and Erastus B. Tyler, not only beat off the attack of Jackson from both his flanks, but at the right moment assumed the offensive, and after a hotly contested fight lasting 2 hours, as night was closing in, he completely defeated the Confederates, who were driven from the field, leaving their dead and wounded and several guns. Banks, coming from Harper's Ferry the next day, continued the pursuit up the valley as far as Mount Jackson. Shields's division in this action numbered about 7,000. Jackson reported his own force as between 3,000 and 3,500. The losses reported on each side are: Shields 590, Jackson 718. Jackson frankly acknowledged his defeat, saying to Johnston, "I engaged him (the enemy) yesterday about 3 P.M. near Winchester, and fought until dusk, but his forces were so superior to mine that he repulsed me with the loss of valuable officers and men killed and wounded. But from the obstinacy with which our troops fought, and from their advantageous position, I am of the opinion that his loss was greater than mine in troops. But I lost 1 piece of artillery and 3 caissons." Jackson's second campaign in the Shenandoah, which gained him in full measure that fame and position which were so near to his heart, occupied about a month. It may be said to have begun in his attack upon General Milroy's forces at McDowell on the 8th of May. In this affair, as in every battle of this famous campaign, he had much larger forces than those opposed to him, a fact entirely to his credit. There were Union troops enough in the department, if they had been properly brought together, to have overwhelmed him. After a fight of several hours, he defeated Milroy, who fell back to join Fremont at the town of Franklin, while Jackson moved eastward to Harrisonburg. On the way, he sent dispatches to Richmond detailing the position of the Union troops and asking permission to attack them. This was granted, and he at once began a swift and stealthy march through New Market and Luray to Front Royal. It was at this time that McClellan was daily clamoring for reinforcements from Washington, and the Government, yielding to his importunity, had promised that McDowell's corps should march overland to join him. The reasons why this promise could not be kept are best set forth in the following dispatch from Mr. Lincoln, whose communications to his generals were always clearer and more definite than any that he received from them. It is dated May 25. General Banks was at Strasburg with about 6,000 men, Shields having been taken from him to swell a column for McDowell to aid you at Richmond, and the rest of his force scattered at various places. On the 23rd, a rebel force of 7,000 to 10,000 fell upon 1 regiment and 2 companies guarding the bridge at Fort Royal, destroying it entirely, crossed the Shenandoah, and on the 24th, yesterday, pushed on to get north of Banks on the road to Winchester. General Banks ran a race with them, beating them into Winchester yesterday evening. This morning a battle ensued between the 2 forces, in which General Banks was beaten back into full retreat toward Martinsburg, and probably is broken up into a total rout. Geary, on the Manassas Gap Railroad, just now reports that Jackson is now near Front Royal, with 10,000 troops following up and supporting, as I understand, the force now pursuing Banks. Also, that another force of 10,000 is near Orleans, following on in the same direction. In this Geary was mistaken. Jackson's and Ewell's forces amounted to 16,000 or 17,000. Stripped bare as we are here, I will do all we can to prevent them crossing the Potomac at Harper's Ferry or above. McDowell has about 20,000 of his forces moving back to the vicinity of Front Royal, and Fremont, who was at Franklin, is moving to Harrisonburg. Both these movements intended to get in the enemy's rear. One more of McDowell's brigades is ordered through here to Harper's Ferry. The rest of his forces remain for the present at Fredericksburg. We are sending such regiments and dribs from here and Baltimore as we can spare to Harper's Ferry, supplying their places in some sort by calling in militia from the adjacent States. We also have 18 cannon on the road to Harper's Ferry, of which arm there is not a single one at that point. This is now our situation. If McDowell's force was now beyond our reach, we should be entirely helpless. Apprehensions of something like this, and no unwillingness to sustain you, have always been my reason for withholding McDowell's forces from you. Please understand this, and do the best you can with the forces you have. Later in the day, the President, now sure that a large and formidable army was drawing near the Potomac, wrote a sharp dispatch to McClellan, urging him either to take this opportunity to attack Richmond or give up the job, to which the general replied calmly that the object of the movement is probably to prevent reinforcements being sent to me, and that the time was very near when he would attack Richmond. The campaign opened thus inauspiciously, for the Union arms went rapidly from bad to worse. A series of doleful mischances succeeded, unrelieved by a ray of good fortune or good conduct. Mr. Lincoln at Washington was exerting himself to the utmost, sending a dozen dispatches a day to Banks, Fremont, McDowell, and McClellan, all admirable in clearness, intelligence, and temper, always directing the right thing to be done and the best way of doing it, but nothing seemed to avail. The original surprise was inexcusable. On the 20th of May, Fremont had reported to Banks that Jackson was on the way to attack him, but no proper preparation was made. After the defeat at Front Royal on the 23rd and at Winchester on the 25th, while Banks was in retreat to the Potomac, the only thought of the President was to stop Jackson at the river and to detain him until a sufficient force could be gathered in the neighborhood of Strasburg to destroy or capture him on his return. Fremont was ordered to cross the mountains to Harrisonburg and come north down the valley with his force. McDowell, with a competent detachment under Shields, was ordered to Front Royal. The victorious force of Jackson was met by a considerable army at the Potomac. These last were mostly raw levies, not inured to marching or to fighting, but they accomplished their purpose of delaying for the moment the advance of Jackson towards Washington. His own intention, as well as his orders from Richmond, were, in the language of General Dabney, to press the enemy at Harper's Ferry, threaten an invasion of Maryland, and an assault upon the Federal capital, and thus make the most energetic diversion possible. But on the 29th, while at Halltown preparing for an attack upon Harper's Ferry, he received information of the movement of troops that had been ordered by the President, which, as Dabney says, imperiously required him to give up that attack and provide for his own safety. He then began his precipitate retreat up the valley, which by its celerity and success gained him even more credit than did his audacious advance. It ought not to have been allowed to succeed. It was perfectly feasible to prevent it. Had the plain orders of the President been obeyed, Jackson could not have escaped from the predicament where his headlong energy and his contempt for his adversaries had placed him. It is idle to talk of his invincibility. He was generally whipped like other men when the conditions were not favorable to him. He was defeated severely at Kernstown in March, when he had been confident of victory. Later, at Gaines's Mill, he did not particularly distinguish himself above others. At White Oak Swamp Bridge and Malvern Hill, his inefficiency in large tactics was recognized and severely criticized by generals on his own side. and Banks, with one-third his force, gave him all the work he could do at Cedar Mountain. If Fremont and McDowell had met him at Strasburg, and Banks had followed upon his heels, as Mr. Lincoln had clearly and explicitly ordered, nothing could have prevented the capture or destruction of his entire command. Each of these generals had his task assigned him. It was in each case perfectly practicable. It involved only an expeditious march to the neighborhood of Strasburg over roads more or less rough, undisturbed by the presence of an enemy in any considerable force. General McDowell's part of the work was performed with his habitual energy and promptitude, notwithstanding the chagrin and displeasure with which he received his orders. Near evening of the 24th of May, the President sent him a dispatch informing him that Fremont had been ordered by telegraph to move from Franklin on Harrisonburg, to relieve Banks and capture or destroy Jackson's and Ewell's forces. Mr. Lincoln continued: "You are instructed, laying aside for the present the movement on Richmond, to put 20,000 men in motion at once for the Shenandoah, moving on the line or in advance of the line of the Manassas Gap Railroad. Your object will be to capture the forces of Jackson and Ewell, either in cooperation with General Fremont, or in case want of supplies or of transportation interferes with his movements. It is believed that the force with which you move will be sufficient to accomplish this object alone. The information thus far received here makes it probable that if the enemy operate actively against General Banks, you will not be able to count upon much assistance from him, but may even have to release him." It is remarkable that the President saw the situation with such accuracy the day before Banks's defeat at Winchester. This order McDowell, though he called it a crushing blow, obeyed at once, directing Shields to take up his march to Catlett's, a station on the Orange and Alexandria road, about halfway between Fredericksburg and Front Royal, and reporting that he had done so. The President sent him an acknowledgment of his alacrity, at the same time expressing his regret at the change of his orders, and adding, "Everything now depends upon the celerity and vigor of your movements." This encouraged the general to make an earnest though respectful protest, which he sent the same night to the President, setting forth his belief that cooperation between himself and Fremont was not to be counted upon, that it would take him a week or 10 days to get to the Valley, that by that time the enemy would have retired. We shall see later that these forebodings at least were not realized. At the same time he telegraphed to Wadsworth, in command at Washington, his deep disgust. He did not think the rebel force in the mountains amounted to 5,000 men. But with all this grumbling, his deeds were better than his words. He pushed Shields forward with the greatest celerity. Shields, who was burning to go to Richmond, marched obediently, but in very bad humor. The dispatches of this officer read like a burlesque of those of his superior. He is loud in contempt of both armies in the Shenandoah. He thought when the movement first began that there was nothing in it, that the enemy would never come north, that if they did they would be hemmed in and destroyed. As late as the 10th of May he was sure they were not there to fight. As he went forward to Front Royal, his boasting spirit asserted itself more and more. "I want no assistance," he said. He promised to give Jackson a bloody reception, to drive the enemy from the Shenandoah, and wanted to know if there was anything else he could do for the President, the task in question being apparently unworthy of his powers. But neither the chagrin of McDowell nor the cannonading of Shields prevented them from striving with all their might to do the work assigned them. The President kept McDowell constantly informed of the condition of affairs, detailing the progress of Jackson northward, and urging the value and importance of the service expected of the Union troops. McDowell showed himself, as he always was, worthy of the confidence reposed in him. In spite of all obstacles, accidents by rail, bad roads, and rough weather, he got Shields's advance into Front Royal on the 30th of May. That is, in little more than half the time he thought he should require for the purpose. The same day the President sent him a dispatch from Fremont saying that he would be at Strasburg, or where the enemy was at 4 p.m., May 31, and another from Saxton at Harper's Ferry, indicating that the enemy was still there. The President added with justifiable exultation, "It seems the game is before you." It remains to be seen how General Fremont executed his share of the task. On the 24th, the President gave him an urgent order to move at once by way of Harrisonburg to the relief of Banks. He promptly replied that he would move as ordered, but made the unfortunate error of choosing an entirely different route from the one assigned him. Thinking the road to Harrisonburg was more or less obstructed and off his line of supplies, he moved northward by way of Petersburg and Moorfield, in the great valley lying west of the Shenandoah Mountains, and did not even inform the President of this discretionary modification of his orders, so that on the 27th, when they were anxiously expecting at Washington to hear from him at Harrisonburg, they were astounded at receiving tidings from him at Moorfield, 2 good days' march from the line of Jackson's retreat, and separated by 2 counties and the Shenandoah range from the place where he was desired and expected to be. In response to the President's peremptory question why he was at Moorfield when he was ordered to Harrisonburg, he made an unsatisfactory reply, alleging the necessity of his choice of route and his assumed discretion as to his orders. Dropping this matter, the President began again urging him forward to Strasburg. There was still time to repair the original error. Jackson was on the Potomac, much farther from the rendezvous than Fremont, but the latter could not be made to see the vital necessity of immediate action. His men were weary, his supplies were deficient, the roads were bad. Blenker's corps was straggling badly. Finally, on the 29th of May, his medical director told him his army needed a whole day's rest. He promptly accepted this suggestion and wasted 24 hours in this manner, while Jackson was rushing his ragged troops, who had known no rest for a month, up the narrow valley that formed his only outlet from destruction or captivity. In one day, says Dabney, the Stonewall Brigade marched from Halltown to the neighborhood of Newton, a distance of 35 miles, and the Second Virginia accomplished a march of more than 40 miles without rations, over muddy roads and amidst continual showers. The race was to the swift. As Fremont's advance entered Strasburg on the 1st of June, the rear guard of Jackson's force was still in sight, leaving the place. The plan of the President, well combined and reasonable as it was, had failed, though no fault of his, and Jackson had escaped. It is the contention of General McClellan and his partisans that the plan could not possibly have succeeded. One critic disposes of the matter by a sneer at the thought of trapping the wily fox, who was master of every gap and gorge in the valley. But an army of 16,000 men of all arms is not a fox. It must have roads to cross mountains and bridges to pass over rivers. If Fremont had obeyed orders and had been where he should have been on the 30th of May, and if Banks and Saxton had kept a closer watch at Harper's Ferry and followed more immediately upon Jackson's rear, Jackson would have been surrounded at Strasburg by 3 times his own force, and would have been captured or his army dispersed and destroyed. This would have been richly worth all its cost, and the most captious or malevolent critic would have had nothing to say against the President who ordered it. There was little prospect of defeating Jackson after he had slipped through the gap between Fremont and McDowell at Strasburg, but nevertheless an energetic pursuit was begun by Fremont up the Shenandoah, and by part of Shields's division up the Luray Valley on the east, the former harassing Jackson's rear with almost daily skirmishes, and the latter running a race with him on a parallel line. There was hardly a possibility now of regaining the lost opportunity. No matter how severely pressed, it was almost surely in Jackson's power to escape across Brown's Gap to Albemarle County, where he would for a time be safe from pursuit. And this course, says Dabney, was in his mind as a final resort. But he was not even driven to this. There was one last chance of inflicting great damage upon him. One of Shields's brigades arrived at the bridge at Port Republic before him, and should either have taken and held or destroyed it. The officer in command did neither, and the bridge immediately after fell into Jackson's hands, giving him command of both sides of the river. The Confederate general and his adjutant and biographer ascribed the capture of this important position to supernatural means. As soon as Jackson uttered his command to seize the bridge, he drew up his horse, and dropping the reins upon his neck, raised both his hands towards the heavens, while the fire of battle in his face changed into a look of reverential awe. Even while he prayed, the God of battles heard, or ever he had withdrawn his uplifted hands, the bridge was gained. It would perhaps be irreverent to add that the bridge was not defended. On the same day, June 8, he fought a sharp but indecisive battle with Fremont at Cross Keys, and retiring in the night, he attacked and defeated Shields's small detachment at Port Republic. The mismanagement of the Union generals had opposed to him on both days forces greatly inferior to his own. Before these battles were fought, the President, seeing that further pursuit was useless, had ordered Shields back to McDowell, Fremont to halt at Harrisonburg for orders, and Banks to guard the posts of Front Royal and Luray. The orders came too late to prevent two unfortunate engagements, but they showed that the civilian at Washington was wiser than the two generals at the front. They both passed thereafter into the ranks of the malcontents, the men with grievances. Shields went back to Washington, where he was received with open arms by the habitual critics of the President. Among them were those of his own household, for we read in Mr. Chase's diary that Shields told him, when he was ordered back, that Jackson's capture was certain, and the general and the secretary held harmonious counsel together over the terrible mistakes of the President. This was the last important service of Fremont. He remained in charge of his department a few weeks longer, until he was placed with others of similar rank under the general command of Pope. He refused to serve under his junior, and was relieved, not appearing again in any conspicuous position, except for a moment in the summer of 1864 as a candidate for the presidency in opposition to Mr. Lincoln. End of chapter 22.